Hey there! Tonight, we're stepping into the dusty heart of the American frontier. And not the Hollywood gloss, but the cold, heavy truth under the brim of a weathered Stetson. You won't find clean heroes, no grand speeches or shining myths, just the creak of leather saddles, the whisper of wind through sagebrush, a handful of desperate souls hardened by unforgiving sun and the unrelenting grind of survival. I remember the rider, alone against an endless sky. Miles behind him, miles ahead. Nothing but the rhythm of hoofbeats and the promise of something wet to cut the dust from his throat. The townspeople knew. They always knew. A stranger meant news or trouble, sometimes both. Their eyes followed him like shadows, measuring, calculating, remembering. Even the law tipped its hat to the ritual, because in these forgotten places, the saloon wasn't just a building. It was the beating heart of civilization's last desperate gamble. Behind those swinging doors lay America's drunken underbelly. Let's step inside.
A saloon at sundown, the anatomy of a frontier, dive the doors swing open. Entering the western saloon, it starts with a creak. A long, low groan of timber as the saloon doors, those iconic batwing things that never really kept out the cold, or the dust, or the smell swing outward with a complaining sigh. In they walk, the evening's first customer. Maybe a ranch hand with a thirst in his throat and a week as worth of trail dust in his boots. Or a prospector, still caked in the highland mud of a claim that may or may not exist. Sometimes it is just someone looking to sit in the heat of other bodies and forget the size of the sky. This is how every night begins. The frontier saloon was less a building than an atmosphere. A cloud of breath, body, and beer. Most were rough rectangles of timber and nail, thrown up in a hurry by carpenters who were often drunk themselves, their angles crooked and roofs sagging with the weariness of too many winters. Some had windows. Most didn't. What they all had was an entrance and invitation. A creaky threshold into the communal murk. Step through that door, and you've entered a different kind of church. The smell hits first. A blend of stale sweat and spilt liquor. Of boots that have never seen a cobbler, and jackets that haven't seen a wash basin since the war. There's wood smoke, because someone's always burning something, sometimes for heat, sometimes just to mask the stink. A little turpentine for cleaning, or maybe just poured into the whiskey to stretch it. A note of vomit, of course. Someone always loses their stomach around supper time. And still, they keep coming. The layout of the lowly saloon, despite what movies suggest, no two saloons looked alike. In the American West of the mid to late 1800s, a saloon might be little more than a tent with a plank balanced between two barrels. Or it might be a full-fledged building with a mirror behind the bar, a piano in the corner, and upstairs rooms that rented by the hour. But nearly all shared some basic features functional, filthy, and faintly desperate. The floor was often bare wood, warped and uneven, littered with a day's worth of dust, peanut shells, tobacco plugs, and whatever else had fallen from mouths and pockets. To make cleanup easier, or let's be honest, to pretend there was cleanup saloon owners would spread sawdust across the floor. This wasn't about ambience. It was about absorption. Sawdust caught the blood from bar fights. It soaked up the beer and the bile. It muffled footsteps and sometimes screams. Tables were few and far between in the cheaper joints. A couple wobbly ones, nailed back together a dozen times, ringed with chairs missing rungs or legs. The bar itself? Usually a long slab of wood, rubbed smooth by elbows and stained by everything else. If you were lucky, there'd be a brass rail to rest your boots on. If you weren't, you'd just plant your feet in a puddle and hope it wasn't fresh. Behind the bar sat a collection of bottles, some labeled, most not. Whiskey, or something calling itself whiskey. Gin that might blind you. Beer if there was a brewer in town, or whatever passed for beer when times were tight. And always, always, a bottle of something clear and mean. The kind of drink that hurt going down and didn't let up for days. There might be a mirror, cracked and fogged, catching the candlelight like a dying star. A few dusty photos tacked to the wall, stagecoach timetables, haunted posters, maybe a tintype of the barmaid who used to work here before she ran off, or disappeared, or married someone with a better hat. The first customers, who walked in, and why saloons didn't open early. No one wanted to be seen drinking before noon, even in a town where the sheriff took his coffee with a splash of rye. But come sundown, they filled fast. Cowboys came first tired, sunburned, paid in coin and aching to spend it. Their world was one of dust and repetition, and the saloon was escape. Loud, warm, full of laughter and shouting and card games and anyone singing off-key in the corner. Miners stumbled in next, faces smeared with soot or clay, shoulders sagging under the weight of hope and failure. Prospecting didn't pay often, but when it did, the first stop was the saloon. The second stop was usually the undertaker. Then came the townsfolk, the blacksmith looking to rest his hammer hand, the schoolteacher looking to forget her classroom, the widow looking for someone to pay for her drink. A traveling peddler might wander in, opening a suitcase of strange trinkets no one could afford. A gambler with slick hair and smoother lies. A preacher, off duty, but still judging, nursing a glass of sarsaparilla like it was holy water. And finally, always, the drifters. The ones who said little and watched much. They knew how to blend into a dark corner, how to nurse a single drink for hours, how to leave without being noticed, sometimes with a pocket heavier than when they entered. The barkeeper, judge, jester, and occasional executioner. He's already there, of course. The barkeep, usually a man, often older, with forearms like fence posts and a beard that doubles as a dust trap. He knows everyone and remembers everything. Who owes him money? Who's banned from dice games? Who's not allowed whiskey anymore because last time they had it, the piano caught fire. He doesn't talk much, except to bark. He can clean a glass, break a bottle over a head, and drag an unconscious body out the back door, all in the same minute. He keeps a shotgun under the bar, though he's more likely to use the club nailed to the end of it. Firearms are messy. Clubs are final. And he's the one who controls the flow of the evening. If the barkeep says it's time to go even if you're mid-song, mid-hand, or mid-fight. He's the closest thing this place has to a god. A god with a rag, a snarl, and very little patience for nonsense. A place between worlds, the saloon wasn't just a watering hole. It was a liminal space, neither respectable nor entirely lawless. A place where schoolmarms and sex workers might share a table. Where soldiers and deserters played poker without mentioning the war. Where women wore men's coats, men wore women's perfume, and no one dared ask too many questions. Outside was the wide, hard land, the prairie, the mesa, the mud of the mining town. Inside was warmth, chaos, comfort, corruption. It was a womb, a fight pit, a chapel, and a stage all at once. And the door swung open again. Another creak. Another customer. The night had only just begun. A floorboard's eye view. Dirt, dust, and detritus. Let's shift perspective, shall we? Forget the swinging doors and whiskey-stained counters. Those highbrow landmarks of Western lore. We're going lower. Much lower. Down to where the spittoons glisten and the sawdust clings. Down where the cockroaches scatter when the lamp kicks on. Down to the floorboards, warped, creaking, and cursed. Because down here, everything ends up eventually. Boot scuffs, broken glass, forgotten poker chips, and the occasional tooth. Bits of tobacco plug hacked out mid-conversation. Clumps of hair pulled during last night's lover's quarrel. Maybe even a mullet, flattened and jammed under a plank. All pressed into the grain like sediment in a drunken archaeological dig. Now let's talk sawdust. Not the clean, citrus-scented kind from a modern workshop. This was pine shavings swept from the back of a mill dumped liberally across the floor, not for charm, but for survival. It absorbed everything. Whiskey spills, bloody noses, the wet splash of someone retching after a bad round of Barkeep Surprise. It was less a cleaning solution and more a sacrificial offering. A desperate attempt to give the floor one more night of service before it gave up entirely. And it wasn't just the bodily fluids. The detritus down here told stories. Crumpled notes. A pawned wedding ring. The shredded remains of a wanted poster some poor soul hoped would never be seen again. A child's marble, long lost and likely stolen. An ivory button that belonged to someone who couldn't afford to miss it. The saloon floor was a map of sins and stains. It whispered of things no one would admit aloud. A secret language of footsteps and drag marks. The uneven spacing of shoeprints from a man who could barely stand. The heavy dent where a head hit hard after a bar fight. The long smear from a body dragged out before dawn, silent and still. Then there were the bugs, fleas from the dogs, lice from the customers, flies that didn't even wait for death to descend. You'd see them land mid-fight, mid-song, mid-prayer. The floor was a buffet, and they were the only ones sober enough to enjoy it. Even the rats had their patterns. They knew the kitchen scraps got swept toward the fireplace, that the boards under the piano were loose enough to hide beneath, that the regular with the limp always dropped jerky from his pocket when he sat. The saloon was a living organism, and the floor was its stomach digesting every broken promise, every spilled secret, every lost cause. And heaven help you if you dropped anything of value down here, because to reach for it meant touching the floor. And touching the floor meant a baptism into the filth you could never fully wash away. The regulars joked about the floorboard fever, but the joke wore thin after the third funeral that month. Still, some did brave it, a gambler on his last dime, the barmaid chasing her only pair of earrings, the preacher looking for a lost cross, not realizing some things were best left buried. The rest of the patrons, they learned to let it go, because in the hierarchy of the Wild West saloon, the floor was always the final judge. Once something fell, it belonged to the underworld, and the underworld didn't return things. It just watched. It soaked, and it remembered. The ones who ran it, barkeeps, bouncers, and broke piano men. If a saloon was a beast, then someone had to ride it, tame it, feed it, sweep up after it, and when necessary, punch it in the teeth. That someone was usually the barkeep, not the polite, vest-wearing mixologist of modern fancy. No, your average frontier barkeep was equal parts chemist, referee, debt collector, and battlefield medic. He didn't craft cocktails. He poured mystery liquids into chipped glasses, stirred them with a knife if needed, and offered no refunds. He knew which barrels to tap and which to avoid unless you wanted a customer to go blind before last call. He watered down whiskey with creek water, stretched gin with turpentine, and cut rum with molasses and lies. He didn't smile often. He couldn't afford to. Smiling encouraged conversation, and conversation encouraged requests, and nobody had time for requests. Not when the bar was 3 deep in dusty cowboys, off-duty deputies, and barely legal drifters looking to wash the trail off their throats. And then there were the bouncers, big men usually, not always muscular, but wide-built like the doors they guarded. Former soldiers, boxers, miners, or just particularly mean fathers who'd run out of people to shout at. They didn't speak much. Their job wasn't diplomacy. It was evacuation. If someone got loud, they'd get warned once, twice if the bouncer liked them. Then came the exit fast, undignified, and usually through one of those thin-pane windows that shattered dramatically but cheaply. These men knew when a fight was brewing before it bubbled. They read shoulders, watched knuckles, and had a sixth sense for the twitch of a man reaching for steel. Some carried batons. Some carried nothing at all but reputation. And in a good saloon, that was enough. In the background, always somehow in the background, was the piano man. He didn't talk much either, mostly because nobody listened. He was the soundtrack to the chaos, the poor soul banging out a ragtime rhythm while bullets flew overhead or lovers screamed at each other in 7 different dialects. His piano was chipped, sometimes missing keys. More than once, he played through a bar brawl without missing a beat, one hand on the keys, the other fending off flying glass. He was paid in drinks, not cash, or in script for meals upstairs if the saloon doubled as a brothel, which it often did. He had 3 songs, one happy, one sad, and one slow enough for the room to forget it was still early. He played them all night on a loop, fingers black with smoke and blood, occasionally glancing toward the back door, like a prisoner wondering if escape was still an option. And then there were the other hands, the nameless helpers who made the place barely functional. The boy who swept the floor, chasing sawdust soaked in sin and sickness. The girl who lit the lamps and refilled the spit buckets. The cook who did unholy things to beans and salt pork behind a curtain that probably hadn't even washed since statehood. The man who checked the cellar for rats and came back with a bite more often than not. These people didn't dream of better. They dreamt of dry boots and quiet nights, 2 things the saloon almost never provided. And behind it all, somewhere upstairs or just out of sight, was the owner. Sometimes a man, sometimes a woman. Always sharp, always watching, always just one ledger away from bankruptcy or brilliance. They owned the building, maybe the land, maybe even the law, if they paid enough. But control? That was an illusion. The saloon wasn't something you owned. It was something you fed nightly, with coin and blood and barkeep sweat. And if you were lucky, it didn't eat you. What they drank: whiskey, turpentine, and snake oil. Let's not romanticize it. The liquor wasn't good. In fact, liquor might be a generous word for the brown, biting mystery fluid that sloshed into tin cups across the American frontier. If you ordered whiskey in a frontier saloon, you weren't selecting a brand, you were gambling on survival. See, true whiskey real aged, oak-barreled stuff was rare and expensive out west. And no one, not even the richest cattle baron, was going to wait 6 years for a dram that might get shot out of his hand in a bar fight. So what you got instead was something that looked like whiskey, smelled like pain, and burned like a branding iron on the way down. It was called rot gut for a reason. A popular recipe included raw alcohol, usually industrial-grade grain spirit, or denatured ethanol mixed with burnt sugar, chewing tobacco, cayenne pepper, and occasionally a dash of turpentine or kerosene to really round out the experience. Some saloon owners added rattlesnake heads to the barrel for kick. Others just lied and said they did. If you wanted gin, well, that was worse. Gin on the frontier was usually made from raw alcohol flavored with turpentine and oil of juniper. The result was a cloudy, oily mess that doubled as both a disinfectant and, in desperate cases, lamp fuel. Rum? Stretch it with molasses? Shoe polish? Brandy? You're dreaming. Beer? Technically, yes, if you had access to ice or a nearby brewer. Otherwise, it was warm, flat, and likely to contain more sediment than carbonation. Saloons often watered it down or poured the same batch for days, covering the staleness with ginger root or spoiled lemon peel. And then there were the so-called medicinal drinks that claimed to cure whatever you had, and a few things you didn't. One popular example, old Dr. Thompson's reinvigorating elixir of life, a thick, syrupy tonic sold from behind the bar that contained alcohol, opium, laudanum, cocaine extract, peppermint, and hope. A few sips would kill a cough, a cold, and your sense of self. Some saloons offered electric bitters, which promised to restore masculine vigor, but mostly restored your relationship with the floorboards. These tonics were often pitched by traveling medicine men or left behind in crates after a fly-by-night show. The barkeep would slap a handwritten label on them and charge triple. Hangover cures were just more alcohol, maybe with an egg stirred in, shell and all. For the truly daring, there was tarantula juice, a frontier euphemism for the kind of hoach so strong and poorly made it gave you the shakes, the sweats or visions of fuzzy-legged hallucinations crawling up your skin. It was often made from wood alcohol methanol, which, as modern science tells us, can cause blindness and death in just the right doses. And right doses were not something the Wild West ever concerned itself with. Even water wasn't safe. If you weren't lucky enough to be near a spring or mountain-fed well, saloon water was pulled from the same river downstream from the livestock or worse. That's why many frontier folks preferred the booze. It might rot your liver, but at least it didn't come with cholera. And so they drank. They drank before breakfast. They drank after funerals. They drank to celebrate, to mourn, to fight, to flirt, and to forget. They drank out of tin cups, cracked mugs, boot flasks, and hollowed-out table legs. They drank standing, sitting, passed out, and sometimes while bleeding from the head. To drink in a saloon was to participate in a ritual older than the West itself. It was a sacrament of survival, an offering to the gods of boredom, fear, rage, and loneliness. It hurt. It tasted awful. And it was the only thing keeping some folks from going completely mad. Or, depending on the night, driving them straight to it. Behind the barroom door, vice, violence, and velvet drapes. You could always feel it in the back of your neck, that tickle of attention, the prickling sense that someone was watching you from behind the velvet curtain. Every saloon had one, give or take. Maybe it was a real velvet curtain, dark red and moth-bitten. Maybe it was just a door marked private that never stayed closed. But behind it, past the bar and the piano and the fog of bad whiskey, was the true heart of the frontier saloon. The room where things happened. Not the shouting, not the drinking, not the occasional flying bottle. Those were just distractions. The real business happened in the back. Let's start with the saloon. Or if you prefer local color, the boarding house, the crib, the company parlor, or Miss Lila's reading room, where nobody ever once saw a book. Many saloons doubled as informal brothels, with upstairs rooms rented by the hour and a cast of soiled doves who earned their keep entertaining miners, cowboys, gamblers, and lonely drummers far from home. These women were often dressed to impress bright colors, feathers in their hair, a dash of perfume to mask the ever-present odor of sweat, whiskey, and lamp oil. They worked in brutal conditions. Some were independent, charging fees and negotiating terms. Others were little more than property controlled by madams or bar owners who took a hefty cut and offered little protection. A good night might bring security. A bad one could mean disease, violence, or vanishing without a trace. But the saloon was also a business hub. The upstairs room wasn't just for pleasure. It was for deals. Land was sold here, cattle contracts signed, banks robbed in theory, and sometimes in advance. If you needed a poker game where the stakes ran higher than anyone could afford, you found it in the back room. If you wanted a place to bribe a sheriff, hire a bounty hunter, or plan a quiet ambush in the hills outside of town, this was where you met. The back room was where reputations were made and undone, where fortunes turned on a single card, where a man might leave richer than he ever dreamed or never leave at all. And don't assume this was some polished, smoky den of elite sin. Often, it was just a table, a hanging lantern, and 2 or 3 grim-faced men with their backs to the wall. The table legs might be sawed slightly short to keep anyone from flipping it. One corner might feature a cot with a blood-stained sheet, a reminder of how last week's deal went. And then there was the gambling. Oh, the gambling. If drinking was the blood of the saloon, cards were its heartbeat. Faro was king in the 19th century, fast, simple, and easy to rig. A dealer with a bent dealing box could turn the odds any way he liked, and most did. Poker was rising, of course, especially among professional gamblers, with names like Slick, One-Eyed Pete, and Miss Clara from Deadwood, who took your money, your horse, and your heart in 3 clean hands. Dice, wheel games, shell games, and the occasional rigged roulette wheel rounded out the fun. Most tables favored the house. Some favored the man with the fastest draw. And let's not forget the fight pit. Some larger saloons featured a cleared space near the back, or even a small fenced ring. It was a place for bare-knuckle boxing, knife dancing, or just settling a grudge with fists and spittle. Bets were taken, blood was spilled, and the sawdust that freshened afterward. The barkeep kept order, sort of. Sometimes he was a brawler himself. Other times he hired a local hard case to swing a bat or a shotgun when things got too rowdy. But usually the room policed itself, because if you caused too much trouble, you didn't just get thrown out. You got remembered. And in towns where grudges outlived marriages, that could be a death sentence. A night in the life of a saloon, when the lamps are lit, opening time on the frontier, it always started the same way before the sun had fully set, before the first shot of whiskey could even be justified by a bad day, before the gamblers came sniffing for suckers. Someone somewhere opened a door and threw out the night's first bucket of piss. That was your sign. It was almost saloon time. The saloon didn't have hours like a proper business. There wasn't a carved sign reading, "Open 4 p.m. to close," because closing times didn't really exist. A frontier saloon opened when the barkeep sobered up enough to sweep the floor or got yelled at by the owner to start pouring. It closed when the last stroke fell off his stool or the sheriff finally kicked the doors in. But if you were lucky enough or unlucky enough to be there at the very start of an evening, you saw the place before the night took hold. You'd find a dim, dusty room already half-shadowed by the creeping dusk outside. Lamps hung from iron hooks in the ceiling, sometimes gas, more often just oil-fed with smoky wicks. Lighting them was a slow affair. The barkeep would move methodically from one to the next, tall matches in hand, cursing when the flames sputtered or the glass chimney slipped and shattered. A boy or a helper might follow behind with a rag and a bottle, half-heartedly wiping down tables sticky from the night before. The air was stale, rank with old beer, tallow, and bodies, but there was something expectant in it too, like a stage just before the curtain rose. The first customers of the evening were always the same, men with nowhere else to be, prospectors who'd come into town to spend just enough money to keep warm before heading back to the mountains, shop boys who couldn't afford to drink, but liked to lean against the wall and watch, old-timers nursing a morning hangover with a second round. You know, the quiet ones who looked harmless until they suddenly weren't. They took their places like ghosts, finding familiar ground. And then came the sounds, the scratch of chairs pulled back, the thunk of bottles on wood, the low murmur of conversation restarting itself. Sometimes a piano. Player, if the place had one, and he wasn't passed out in a ditch, would shuffle to his bench and test a few keys. Half in tune, half in spite. You could hear boots on floorboards before you saw the wearers, spurs jangling faintly, a belt creaking under the weight of a pistol, laughter from outside, a shout from the alley, and behind it all, the rhythmic swish of a woman's skirts as she descended the stairs, powdered and painted, ready to begin her long night of tolerating men who thought themselves clever. And here's the thing about frontier saloons. They ran on rhythm, not rules. there was a tempo to the night. At opening, things moved slow. Just whispers and idle cards. The barkeep poured more than he cleaned. The whiskey was warm. The beer was tepid. But nobody minded, because the real action hadn't arrived yet. This was the time for setting the stage. The regulars picked their usual corners. The gambler set up his table 3 decks ready, dealer's chair already wiped. A bounty hunter in a long coat sat near the door, always facing out. A pair of cowboys too broke to drink settled for water and a game of spit, hoping someone would buy them a round later just to feel generous. Behind the bar, the drinks were lined up for the rush to come bottles of rot-gut rye, dubious gin, maybe one decent bottle of imported whiskey, kept hidden and overpriced for special occasions or wealthy fools. And just when the light outside died down for good, when the oil lamps gave the room its permanent amber haze, and the piano found a tune even the flies liked, a saloon became something else entirely. It woke up. The heat of the night, whiskey, dice, and unspoken rules. The saloon at full tilt wasn't a place for the faint-hearted or the sober. Once the sun surrendered and the lamps took over, everything turned louder, darker, and just a little more dangerous. It was like a dam had broken somewhere upstream. Suddenly, men you hadn't seen all day came slinking in through the batwing doors. Drovers flushed from payday, gamblers with sharp eyes and sharper sleeves, outlaws who'd sworn they were just passing through. The place filled with boots and belts, banter and body odor, the sawdust underfoot already damp with things best not named. By now, the piano was in full swing. Not elegant, not even on key, but fast, recklessly fast. Tinny chords slammed together with abandon by a man who knew he was being paid not to be good, but to be loud enough to drown out the fights. And it was working. The barkeep, now on his 5th shirt sleeve of the night, had entered his performance mode. He was a one-man orchestra behind the counter-flipping tin cups, sliding glass tumblers down the bar, sloshing brown liquid into open hands. Whiskey here didn't come with tasting notes. It came with a wince, maybe a cough. The good stuff, if you could call it that, was barely drinkable. The bad stuff had been watered down twice, once with river water, once with regret. More than one bottle had a skull and crossbones scratched faintly into the glass. And yet, the patrons came back for more, because it worked. It burned going down and made everything else burn a little less. Dice clattered, cards slapped, voices rose. In one corner, a game of faro pulled in both veterans and victims. The gambler in charge dealt with one hand while fingering the derringer in his vest with the other. The house always won, but the house didn't always walk out unbruised. Unspoken rules ruled the night. You didn't touch a man's hat. You didn't draw your pistol unless you meant it. You didn't mess with the piano player unless you wanted your name to be the next punchline in a gravestone epitaph. You paid your tab, or someone did it for you after rifling through your pockets. And then there was the whiskey tax. Not a formal fee, but a kind of tribal custom. If you bought a bottle and didn't share, you were either rich, stupid, or dead soon. Most slid the bottle down the bar with a grunt and a nod. Others poured communal shots, not bothering to wipe the rim between turns. Germs weren't a concern. Cholera could wait. Women, when they appeared, were less guests than fixtures. Some were working. Some weren't. Some played both sides of that fence, depending on the drinker's generosity and the hour. They weren't there to be saved. They were there to survive. And in that saloon, survival came from knowing how to smile at the right man, slap the wrong one, and vanish before anyone could ask questions. Heat rose, not just from the lamps, but from bodies, from breath, from the sheer density of vice. Sawdust underfoot soaked up sweat, beer, spit, blood, whatever had spilled in the last 30 seconds. You didn't want to know. Best not to think about the damp squish beneath your heel, when you stepped up to the bar. Just tip your hat back, down your drink, and keep one eye open. The saloon, in its most primal state, wasn't a building. It was a living thing, a beast with 1,000 teeth and a breath that stank of tobacco and regret. And by now, that midnight was close, and the fighting words had started to fly. It had begun to bear its fangs. Powder, paint, and perfume. The women who worked the floor. If the men brought the noise to the saloon, the women brought the choreography. They were the ones who moved with intention through the swamp of spilled beer and broken promises, weaving between poker tables and passed-out ranch hands like dancers in a very seedy ballet. And while the cowboys and card sharps got all the ink and dime novels, it was the women of the saloon who kept the engine running greased with charm, painted faces, and just enough mystery to keep a man paying for drinks he couldn't afford. They came in two rough categories, those on the stage and those on the floor. Up on the stage, the saloon singer might have been called a nightingale in polite tones, though most sounded more like warbling magpies who'd taken a bullet to the beak. But that didn't matter. She wasn't there for vocal perfection. She was there for atmosphere. A little song, a little wiggle of the hips, maybe a bawdy rhyme or two between verses. It was all part of the illusioning of sparkle, to distract from the fact that the whiskey tasted like varnish, and the man next to you might be cheating. Back on the floor, dance hall girls twirled through the crush of bodies, skirts lifting just enough to suggest scandal, never quite delivering. Their job was to flirt, dance, and crucially keep the men drinking. Most were paid by the drink, earning a cut every time some lovesick rancher bought her a watered-down shot of gin she had no intention of drinking. She'd raise the glass, giggle behind a fan, and discreetly pour it into a spit bucket under the table. Rinse, repeat, retire with coin in hand, and none of the side effects. The air around them was a cocktail of perfume and sweat, stale cigar, smoke, and face powder. Painted cheeks, red-stained lips, thick lashes. These weren't luxuries. They were armor. In a town where beauty faded faster than a bottle of rye, makeup wasn't vanity. It was strategy. The powder masked bruises. The rouge added life to sleep-starved skin. A dash of cologne behind the ear could cover the scent of 10-hour shifts and no time for a bath. Behind the glamour, though, was grit. These women weren't naive. They knew exactly what room they were walking into every night. Some had come west for adventure. Others had been pushed there by hard luck, broken homes, or smooth-talking recruiters who promised theater contracts and delivered saloons with dirt floors. A few still carried lace handkerchiefs and spoke in proper grammar. Most didn't bother. They weren't prostitutes, not all of them. Anyway, that was a separate arrangement, handled through back rooms, quiet nods, and a bar owner's cut. But the line between entertainer and escort was porous, fluid, malleable by money, loneliness, and the sheer math of survival. They had rules. No touching without permission. No credit. No fighting in front of the customers. And always carry a hatpin long enough to ruin a man's weekend. Some worked in teams. One would distract while the other picked pockets. Some played the long con, pretending to fall in love with a traveler just long enough to rob him blind once he passed out in a rented bed. Others were kind, genuinely kind, but never for free. And there were stories. So many stories. The girl who shot a man with his own Derringer after he pulled it on her in the alley. The woman who married a bartender, ran off with the piano player, and came back 2 years later as the owner. The lady who ran a Bible study on Wednesdays and strip poker on Fridays. None of it would show up in history books, of course. These were footnotes at best forgotten names who served up flirtation, fake affection, and shot glasses by the dozen, night after night, from men who wouldn't remember them in the morning. But while the cowboys roared and the gunslingers postured, it was the women who kept the beat of the saloon steady. Their steps were quiet, but their presence? Absolutely central. When the shots get loud, brawls, blood, and closing time, by now the air was thick enough to chew smoke, sweat, and spilled bourbon hanging in clouds that barely shifted when the doors opened. If the early hours of the saloon were about illusion, charm, music, seduction, and closing time was about reality. Ugly, loud, and usually bleeding. Tension simmered under the floorboards all night, just waiting to boil over. Maybe someone caught his girl smiling too long at the piano man. Maybe a miner lost too many hands in a row and decided the dealer was too lucky by half. Or maybe it was just a Tuesday and a man woke up angry. The cause didn't matter. The outcome was predictable. It started with voices. Raised, then shouted. Chairs scraped back. A glass shattered. Boots stomped. And then, with the inevitability of a train off the tracks, the whole room erupted. Bar brawls in the Wild West weren't staged. They didn't look like the rolling tumble routines from Hollywood movies. They were fast, messy, and over in minutes, unless someone pulled iron, and then they were over faster. Knuckles split open on teeth. Beer mugs cracked skulls. The occasional banjo met its end against someone's spine. Someone always flipped a table, though it rarely needed flipping. The bartender ducked and grabbed the expensive bottles first. The girls either fled or slipped out of sight with practiced ease. The gamblers melted into the shadows like ghosts. And the piano? Stopped cold. No one ever kept playing through a fistfight, unless they wanted to be mistaken for a target. If there was a bouncer, or just a large man paid to pretend, he might try to break it up. More often, the saloon owner would wait behind the bar with a loaded scattergun and a sigh that said, "Not again." Some owners posted signs. Nitrogen monoxide fighting. $10 fine. You break IT. You buy IT. Duels out back only. These signs were largely decorative. And then came the shooting. Gunplay wasn't common, but when it happened, it ended things quick. A shot indoors didn't sound like the clean bang from the movies. It was deafening, echoing off the walls and making your ears ring. Smoke poured from the barrel. People screamed. Someone fell, maybe a cheater, maybe the guy who brought fists to a gunfight, maybe just the poor bastard carrying drinks through the room at the wrong time. Doctors, if they were nearby and awake, didn't ask questions. They just patched what they could and let whiskey handle the rest. If the town had a sheriff, he might wander in 10 minutes later, ask what happened, and leave again if no one was crying too loud. In some towns, the saloon was the law. In others, it was the courtroom and the gallows. And still, the night had to end. Eventually, when the bodies were dragged out, when the last few drinks were poured and the lights dimmed low, the saloon sagged into an eerie silence. Chairs were righted. Glass was swept. The air stank of gunpowder and regret. Sometimes, a man would sit back down like nothing happened and finish his drink next to a bloodstain. And tomorrow night, it would all happen again. Because in these towns, saloons weren't just places to drink. They were pressure valves, where men came to burn off whatever rage, fear, lust, or desperation had built up under the surface of their dusty, sun-baked lives. When it blew hard. But at least it blew somewhere with sawdust on the floor and a back door for sneaking out. Cleaning up the carnage. After hours in the saloon, dawn was still an idea on the horizon when the doors creaked open again. Not for drinkers, but for cleaners. Someone had to make sense of the disaster left behind by 100 boots, 3 fistfights, 2 sobbing cowboys, and 1 unfortunately well-placed bullet hole in the ceiling. That someone was rarely paid enough, almost never thanked, and absolutely essential. Cleaning up a saloon after closing wasn't a chore, it was combat. Start with the floor. Sawdust soaked in blood, vomit, tobacco spit, and stale beer had to be swept up and replaced daily. No amount of fresh shavings could completely erase the smell. It just added another layer to it, like perfume over a corpse. Buckets of water were hauled in from a nearby well. Unless there was a cistern out back either way, it wasn't hot, it wasn't clean, and it wasn't optional. The mop, if there was one, was usually just a rag on a stick. More often, it was hands and knees, scrubbing with lye soap that stung like the devil and left your palms raw. And you couldn't ignore the dark puddle in the corner, because that was where the drunk had relieved himself halfway through his game of Pharaoh. Then came the dishes, though calling them that is generous. Tin cups, whiskey bottles, cracked mugs. Most weren't washed so much as dunked in gray water and wiped with a cloth already ruined by too many nights. Lipstick smudges, blood rings, even the occasional tooth still stuck to the rim. It all came off or didn't. And either way, the cup went back on the shelf. Mirrors behind the bar were wiped down, smeared again, wiped again. Shot glasses had to be checked for chips. The good whiskey was locked up. The bad whiskey was restocked cut with turpentine or tobacco spit, depending on your bartender's mood and moral compass. And then there was the furniture. Broken chairs were stacked out back. Tables were nailed back together if they were lucky. The piano was retuned once a week if the saloon could afford it. Otherwise, it just stayed sad and sharp. Someone might find a gun under a table, or a garter belt, or a tooth. One cleaner reportedly found a live snake curled inside a boot. Another found a preacher. The rooms upstairs, if the saloon had them, were cleaned by the women themselves, or the youngest, newest girl on the roster. Sheets were shaken out. Chamber pots were emptied. Curtains were drawn against the sun. Perfume was dabbed to mask everything else. Nothing was washed, just rearranged. Outside, it was worse. Out back, the alley held secrets. The drunk who hadn't quite made it home. The man who'd lost too much and found the bottom of a bottle. The stain in the dirt that no one would admit came from a body. Vultures circled higher in the sky than usual. Dogs sniffed warily. The outhouse reeked. And the spittoon behind the door still needed to be dumped. Some poor soul did it all without complaint, because there was always another night to prepare for. Another rush. Another brawl. Another man who need a drink to forget the thing he'd done or the thing he'd seen. And then, when everything was clean enough, never truly clean, just acceptable, someone would light the lamps, wipe the bar, and open the door. Another night was always coming. The liquid lies we drank rot gut and rye. The origins of frontier whiskey. There's a certain romantic picture we all carry of whiskey in the Old West. A half-empty bottle, cork chewed soft, amber liquid swirling inside like fire and freedom. Maybe it's in the hand of a lonesome cowboy, maybe clutched by a poker cheat with one eye on the exit. But that glowing golden spirit, that warm oaky finish and clean burn, that's not the whiskey of the frontier, not by a long shot. No, the whiskey of the Wild West was a different beast, entirely raw, vicious, barely legal in today's terms, and more likely to pickle your guts than warm your soul. It was called rot gut for a reason. And tonight, as you drift off to sleep, we're going to swirl a little of it in the glass and take a slow, grim sip. In the beginning, the West wasn't much for distilling. The early pioneers were too busy trying not to die of dysentery, snakebite, or loneliness to worry about aging bourbon in oak barrels. And most didn't have the patience. What they wanted was strong, fast liquor. Something that could kill the cold, cure a cough, settle nerves, and if necessary, double as lamp fuel or disinfectant. Enter frontier whiskey, a mash of corn or rye, or whatever grains could be bartered from the nearest homestead. It was distilled in rough copper stills, often built on site by amateur alchemists more inspired by desperation than skill. This wasn't some grand Kentucky tradition passed down through generations. This was get it hot, get it out, get it down. The result was a clear, fiery liquid more moonshine than the smooth sippin' stuff we romanticize today. It scorched the throat, rattled the bones, and depending on the quality, might even contain a few bonus flavors: unfiltered charcoal, copper residue, or the occasional splinter from a barrel reused too many times. But it was called whiskey, and that was enough. Bottled spirits were scarce in the early days. So much of what passed for whiskey arrived in barrels. No labels, no brands. Just big sloshing casks rolled off wagons and hauled behind the bar, tapped like kegs and served in chipped mugs or cloudy glassware. Most saloons didn't even bother pretending it was top shelf. Some bars would dilute a barrel with water, toss in a few drops of burnt sugar to give it color, maybe steep it with tobacco to simulate complexity. The word authentic didn't apply. Potent did. Travelers quickly learned that the word whiskey meant different things in different towns. In one settlement, it might taste like diluted vinegar. In another, it might be halfway decent. In others still, it was closer to industrial cleaner. Locals would often develop a taste, or at least a tolerance, for the version served at their hometown watering hole. Outsiders weren't always so lucky. The term rot gut came not from poetic exaggeration, but cold intestinal truth. Many of these homemade or barrel-aged spirits were contaminated, whether from improper distillation or the dubious substances added afterward. Methanol poisoning wasn't just a worst-case scenario, it was a recurring side effect. The symptoms could range from splitting headaches and vomiting to temporary blindness or death. Some drinkers called it prairie poison. Others joked that if you didn't vomit after your first shot, the second one would fix that. And yet, it was popular, ubiquitous even. Whiskey was a currency, a ritual, a rite of passage. It was how deals were sealed, how friendships were made, and how long nights blurred into blackness. Ranchers drank it to celebrate births, bury friends, and mark the passing of cattle drives. Outlaws swigged it before robbing trains. Soldiers poured it over wounds. Miners drank to forget how many had died beneath the earth. And bartenders? They played the part of priests and poisoners alike. No credentials required, just a steady hand, a tough jaw, and enough savvy to keep a drunk from smashing the mirror behind the bar. Some western towns had distilleries of their own rudimentary operations, usually cranking out firewater by the barrel and sending it down the road to the nearest thirsty outpost. Dodge City, Deadwood, Tombstone, they all saw their share of this liquid commerce. But much of it came from back east, shipped in rough crates and rickety wagons, aging not in the comfort of cellars, but in the blistering sun and road dust of the frontier. One popular source was rectified spirits-neutral grain alcohol that had been redistilled, then flavored with various ingredients to simulate whiskey. The U.S. government didn't regulate liquor the way it does now. If you could make it, bottle it, and convince someone to pay for it, that was good enough. The label might read Old Kentucky Reserve, but that meant nothing. There was no Kentucky involved, no reserve either. And yet, people drank it. They drank it because it was available, because it was necessary, and because for many, it was the only thing between them and the echoing dark. So as you drift off tonight, imagine yourself sitting at a crook bar in a town whose name you won't remember. The air smells of smoke and varnish. A glass thunks in front of you, filled with a murky amber liquid that might kill a weaker man. You lift it, you drink. It burns, it bites, it blurs. That's not whiskey. That's history. And the night is still young. Turpentine and tobacco juice. Popular mixers you'll never want to try. There's a clink of glass and the unmistakable glug-glug of something being poured behind the counter. But don't get too cozy just yet, because what is being poured into your cup is just whiskey. Not really, not even close. Out on the raw edge of civilization, far from the distilleries of Kentucky or the wine cellars of genteel cities back east. There were no rules for what counted as a proper drink. And so, in the dim, greasy light of a frontier saloon, your liquor might arrive mixed with just about anything that smelled strong and burned going down. Turpentine? Sure. Tobacco juice? Why not? Formaldehyde, camphor oil, blackstrap molasses, cayenne pepper, and kerosene all made guest appearances in the glass, each one masquerading as a flavor, a cure, or a kick. Turpentine, believe it or not, was a popular choice. It gave that sharp sting people associated with real liquor, and its thick, piney taste helped disguise bad grain alcohol or worse, wood alcohol. Some barkeeps even swore it had medicinal value, pitching it as a remedy for everything from saddle sores to the shakes. They weren't entirely wrong. Turpentine was used in poultices and salves, but taken by the mouthful, night after night, it was a shortcut to madness or death. Tobacco juice, on the other hand, was the cowboy's garnish of choice. In some saloons, a single bottle might be used by a dozen men, each spitting into it, mixing their own plug of chaw into the dregs for flavor. The result was a thick, bitter syrup that curled your toes and scorched your gut. To drink it wasn't a pleasure, it was a statement, a test of manhood, or maybe just a way to make your taste buds surrender and stop caring. Molasses was the sweetener of last resort, especially in frontier rum made from fermented corn or sorghum. It clung to the throat and made even the vilest concoction seem like something your granny might approve of, if only because it tasted like burnt cookies. Toss in a few slivers of red pepper or a thimbleful of gunpowder, and you had yourself a party. Then there was strychnine. Not intentionally, of course, but some amateur chemists on the prairie used it along with arsenic and carbolic acid as preservatives or fortifiers. In small enough doses, it might just leave you feeling jittery. In larger ones, well, you wouldn't be telling stories about it afterward. Tales abound of saloons that killed 3 men in one night with a bad batch of homebrew. And still the regulars lined up the next evening, hoping this round might be the charm. The oddest mixers, though, weren't even liquid. Some saloons floated insects in their drinks accidentally, or on purpose. Dead flies meant the liquor had kick, a bit of grit or sawdust in your mug. That was just proof it came from a place that didn't waste anything, not even the cleaning sweepings. And if you asked what kind of whiskey it was, the barkeep might lie or laugh. Most didn't bother labeling their concoctions at all. The only question that mattered was, do you want it strong or do you want it quick? Because in the drunken underbelly of the West, nobody expected good taste. They just wanted something that burned, something that blurred the day, and anything that made them forget the smell of blood and boots and manure that clung to everything. So drink up, traveler. The sawdust is already soaked, and the night is still young. Home brews and hellfire, DIY alcohol on the prairie, out on the dusty reaches of the American frontier, where distilleries were dreams and imports were as rare as a clean shirt. People got inventive. When thirst came calling, and it always did, frontier folk didn't wait for a supply wagon. They built their own stills, stoked their own fires, and rolled the dice with every gulp of whatever they managed to cook up. What passed for whiskey in these parts wasn't aged, filtered, or tested. It was homegrown, often made from corn, wheat, or rye, fermented in barrels that once held pickles, nails, or livestock feed. If it had starch, you could ferment it. If it burned your throat and made you forget your troubles, it counted as liquor. These prairie-born brews went by many names: popskull, busthead, coffin varnish, chain lightning, panther sweat. Colorful words for drinks that made your head spin and your knees forget their job. The nicknames weren't exaggerations. Many batches were barely drinkable, even by frontier standards. But when your world was cold, hard, and lonesome, anything that made the edges blur felt like salvation. The distilling process itself was equal parts science and superstition. Homemade stills were cobbled together from scrap iron, copper tubing, kettles, tin cans, and whatever else wasn't nailed down. Old cook pots and radiator coils were favorites. The result? A bubbling, hissing contraption that looked more like a death trap than a drink machine. Firing one up wasn't just a way to pass the time. It was an act of risk and ritual. Get the heat wrong, and the mash could explode. Use the wrong materials, and your final product might leach lead, antifreeze, or worse. There were no instructions, just passed down knowledge, trial and error, and a willingness to take your chances. Some folks added strange ingredients to improve the flavor or boost the punch. Tobacco leaves were common. So were match heads, turpentine, chewing gum, pepper oil, or black powder. Stories survive of moonshine that was thick as syrup, glowing faintly in the dark, or strong enough to peel paint off a barn door. The most infamous recipes weren't just alcoholic. They were borderline industrial solvents. And yet, these home brews were popular. They were cheaper than imported spirits, and often traded for everything from bullets to bread. In saloons that couldn't afford real whiskey, this DIY hoach filled the gap, sometimes sold under names like Prairie Dew or Frontier Gin, though it was rarely either. In places too remote for even a traveling merchant, settlers made their own stills behind barns, inside caves, or beneath floorboards. Entire towns had unofficial alcohol districts, dense thickets along riverbanks or ravines, where the moonshine flowed and the law didn't. Even children knew what the still looked like. Even preachers looked the other way, so long as folks kept it quiet and didn't go blind from the wrong batch. But going blind did happen. So did seizures, paralysis, hallucinations, and death. Not everyone knew how to separate the toxic foreshots, the first portion of distilled alcohol, from the safe middle cut. Many didn't even know the difference. The result? Some drank and died. Others drank and just wished they had. Still, people kept making it, because alcohol wasn't just a luxury, it was a release. A temporary escape from a life of bone-chilling cold, ceaseless labor, and isolation, so deep it echoed. One good sip might make you forget that you were 3 days' ride from the nearest neighbor, or that your last bath was in the same creek the cattle drank from. They called it hellfire for a reason. It burned all the way down and lit something deep inside you. Hope, maybe, or just enough courage to make it through another brutal night. So here's to prairie whiskey. Cheap, reckless, and homemade. It didn't have a label, but it had a legacy. The watered-down truth, bar tricks and poisonings in the rough-and-tumble saloons of the Wild West. The most honest part of your drink was the lie told before you swallowed it. That aged Kentucky bourbon being poured from a dusty bottle? Odds are, it hadn't seen a day in Kentucky, and the only thing it had aged in was a pickle jar in the back room. The liquid might have started life as something vaguely alcoholic, but by the time it reached your cup, it had been watered down, spiked, dyed, and doctored until it barely resembled anything fit for human consumption. The barkeep's job wasn't to provide quality. It was to stretch supply, turn a profit, and keep the drunks coming back, or at least keep them upright long enough to order another round. If a full bottle could be turned into 3 or 4 with a little sleight of hand, so much the better. No one was asking for tasting notes. They were just trying to forget. Water was the first and simplest additive, but barkeeps didn't stop there. They got creative. Used to chewing tobacco steeped in hot water could add a deep brown color to fake the look of expensive whiskey. Red pepper gave it a kick and covered up any moldy or metallic aftertaste. Ink, soot, molasses, burnt sugar, and even iodine were mixed in to give it the right look, burn, or funk. It was less a drink and more a potion crafted with all the care of someone mixing kerosene with Kool-Aid. Then there was the dangerous stuffwood alcohol, turpentine, creosote. All of it added for body or bite, but every bit of it capable of ruining your liver, your eyesight, or your day. In fact, many frontier deaths quietly recorded as accidents or illness were really the result of bad booze. Strychnine, for example, was sometimes used in small doses to mimic the flush of alcohol. A few drops made you feel lively. A few more made you very dead. And yet, most patrons knew, or at least they suspected. You didn't go into a frontier saloon expecting a civilized cocktail. You went in knowing the drink might be 30% rot gut, 20% water, and the rest anyone's guess. But after a week on the trail or a month in a mining camp, even toxic swill could feel like heaven in a tin cup. Saloons developed their own methods to mask the worst offenses. Some added raw eggs to give the drink a creamy body. Others stored the hoach in burnt barrels to add a smoky flavor. More than one bartender proudly displayed aged whiskey bottles filled that very morning with railroad ethanol and a squirt of caramel coloring. And of course, there was always the trick of setting the drink on fire, nothing like a showy blue flame to distract you from the contents. Some even invented fake brands on the spot. Eagle's Claw Reserve, Gold Dust Bourbon, Buffalo Spirit Rye, completely made-up names, but they sounded just fancy enough to pass. Labels were hand-drawn or glued on with flour paste. A few enterprising saloon keepers even reused glass bottles from legitimate distillers, refilling them from a barrel of something far less reputable behind the bar. Did anyone complain? Occasionally. But complaints didn't travel far when the man behind the counter had a double-barrel shotgun mounted under it, or when the local sheriff was just as drunk on the same stuff. Poisonings were part of the territory. A bad batch might leave 10 men sick and 2 men buried. But the real danger came when drinks were intentionally spiked. If a card shark needed someone out of the game, or a jealous lover wanted a rival silenced, slipping something into the whiskey was easier than pulling a trigger. Few asked questions, and even fewer lived long enough to regret it. In some cases, saloon keepers themselves added medicine to troublesome patrons' drinks, something to make them sleepy, compliant, or just too woozy to cause trouble. Knockout drops, laudanum, opium, even crushed glass in extreme cases. If a cowboy had worn out his welcome, he might be wheeled out the back before sunrise, never knowing what hit him. So the next time you raise a glass in some dim, wood-planked watering hole in the west, remember, that burn in her throat? It might be whiskey, or it might be formaldehyde. Either way, you probably paid too much. What it cost to forget, a drink's price in coin. And consequences. A drink in the Wild West wasn't just a pour, it was a pact. And once you raised that glass, you were agreeing to more than the cost of a nickel or a dime. You were buying a moment of escape, a little heat against the cold of the world. But like everything out on the frontier, the price was never as simple as what jingled in your pocket. Let's start with the basics. In most frontier saloons, the cost of a shot of whiskey, and we reusing that term very loosely, ranged from 5 to 25 cents, depending on the location, the barkeep, and how brazenly it had been diluted. 5 cents got you what locals sometimes called chain lightning or cactus juice. It burned going down and lit a fire coming back up. For 10 cents, you might get something marginally more tolerable, though not necessarily more legal. In towns where legitimate whiskey had to be hauled in by wagon or train, the price could spike dramatically. Places like Deadwood or Virginia City saw prices double or triple during boom periods. And in remote mining or lumber camps, where supply lines were unreliable, a bottle of rot gut could fetch more than a day's wages. But money was only one part of the deal. Each drink came with risks that modern drinkers would find shocking. There was no regulation, no health code, no such thing as proof. You were as likely to buy blindness as you were a buzz. Methanol poisoning wasn't rare, it was expected. And it didn't always kill. Sometimes it just damaged. Shaky hands, cloudy eyes, Memory loss and violent outbursts were common among the long-term regulars. Men were slowly pickling themselves from the inside out. Then there were the social costs. Drinking was part of the culture. Yes, but it also marked you. A miner who stumbled in every evening after work was just one of the boys. But a man who never left the saloon? He got a reputation. Lush, soaker, whiskey drowner, all terms for the downward spiral. And in towns with only one preacher and one jail cell, a man who drank too much usually meant both. Many drank to forget wars, failed crops, lost families, aching joints, and empty futures. But forgetting, it turns out, is expensive, especially when it leads to violence. The number of shootings, stabbings, and savage beatings that started with a slurred insult over a bottle is incalculable. Saloon floors soaked up more blood than some battlefields. And all of it because someone had one drink too many. Some men lost everything. Their wages, gone by Tuesday. Their boots, traded for a bottle. Their horses, their homes, their self-respect. Alcohol dependency wasn't called addiction yet, but it ruined lives just the same. And for the women connected to these men, wives, sisters, daughters, the cost was often even higher. Saloons were places of male dominance, of recklessness, and of danger. Behind the swinging doors lay a world that could bankrupt more than just your coin purse. Then there rests the matter of those drinking for profit-confidence men and hustlers who used alcohol as bait. A drunken cowboy was a mark. Easy to rob, easy to cheat at cards, easy to provoke into a duel he'd never win. Some saloons even hired women to cozy up to a customer and keep him ordering drinks. Drinks she didn't actually drink herself. They were called hurdy-gurdy girls in some circles, and they worked the floor like sharks in petticoats. The longer you stayed drunk, the more money you'd part with, and the more you'd regret come morning. Yet, even with all these risks, the demand never stopped. Because out here, the cost of not drinking could feel even steeper. The West was a place of loneliness and silence. For many, the saloon was the only warmth in town, the only laugh, the only bit of music or chatter they'd hear in days. The only place where a man could talk without being talked about. And for that, even if the whiskey was poison, the price still seemed worth it. So a man paid his dime, lifted his glass, and looked away from the future. Because in the Wild West, forgetting was a business. And business was always booming. The poker table pantheon, kings, cheats, and busted flushes poker wasn't just a game in the Wild West saloon. It was a religion, a power play, and the ultimate distraction from the dust and desperation outside. Around those rough-hewn tables, kings and cons rubbed elbows. Men who'd never seen a church pew were ready to swear oaths as binding as any preacher a sermon. The poker table was where fortunes were made and lost over a handful of cards, flicked wrists, and cold stares. It was the saloon's pulpit, the stage where gamblers, cheats, and hopefuls sat shoulder to shoulder, bound by the unspoken rules of bluff, chance, and cold calculation. But don't be fooled, this was no genteel card club. Cheating was as common as spilled whiskey, and the cheats were often as skilled as the honest men. From marked decks and sleight of hand to hidden cards and secret signals, every trick in the book was used to tip the odds. The best hustlers could read your tells before you'd even blinked, while the desperate or drunk couldn't tell their aces from their elbows. The deck itself was a weapon. Cards bent or sliced to reveal their faces to only the sharpest eyes. Some players hid cards up sleeves, in boots, or even inside hats. A lucky riffle might mean winning a pot worth a week's wages, or earning a bullet in the back for cheating someone twice your size. And then there were the legends, the players who lived by the cards, with names whispered in every saloon from Tombstone to Dodge City. Men like Wild Bill Hickok, who carried aces and eights to the grave. Doc Holliday, whose quick hands were matched only by his deadly temper. Or Poker Alice, the sharp-witted woman who could outplay any man at the table. But the table was also a place of high tension and raw nerves. A busted flush wasn't just a bad hand. It could trigger a fight, a shouting match, or worse. The line between bluff and insult was thin, and many a gunfight was born from a missed bet or a disputed deal. The stakes went beyond money. To lose at poker was to lose respect. And in a world where respect was your only real currency, that loss could spiral quickly into violence or exile from the room altogether. Every hand played was a dance of power, trust, and treachery, where the only guarantee was that no one walked away unchanged. So the next time you imagine a frontier saloon, picture the poker table as its heart a chaotic altar where men gambled with more than just cards. Where kings fell, cheats thrived, and every hand held the weight of a life. Fiddles, flat notes, and foul breath. The music that numbed the nerves in every dusty saloon across the West. Music was more than decoration. It was the heartbeat that kept the chaos from swallowing everyone whole. But don't expect delicate sonatas or fine orchestras. Here, the soundtrack was rough, raw, and often just flat enough to match the sour taste of the whiskey. The fiddle was king, often played by a traveler with a weather-beaten face and a rougher past than anyone cared to ask about. It filled the room with the kind of tunes that could make a lonely miner tap a boot or a drifter pause long enough to remember what home felt like, if only for a moment. Yet the music was rarely polished. Notes would crack like a whip or stumble awkwardly, drowned out by the hum of drunken conversation and the occasional brawl. Flat fiddles, strings out of tune, broken bows, or a careless player were part of the charm, if you could call it that. The imperfect music fit the imperfect people and the imperfect lives they led. Saloons might have a piano too, but these were often battered relics with half the keys missing, played by someone who could only manage a few basic chords. The goal wasn't skill, it was noise, rhythm, and a steady distraction from the grinding boredom or looming despair outside. And then there were the singers, the cowboys, miners, and drunks who'd belt out rough ballads and bawdy songs, their voices raw and voices cracked from too much whiskey and too little water. Their songs told tales of lost loves, far-off places, and hard luck, sometimes ending in raucous laughter or sudden tears. But the smell in these rooms told its own story. Foul breath hung thick, a mix of tobacco, sweat, whiskey, and neglect. The players' mouths were battlefields of rot and grime, but they sang on because silence was worse. Music in these saloons wasn't about perfection, it was survival. A shaky tune might steady a shaking hand, drown out the ghosts that lingered, or simply fill the empty hours until the next shot was poured. The flat notes and sour breaths were the soundtrack to desperation and fleeting joy. So next time you picture a Wild West saloon, listen not for the polished score, but for the creak of a bow, the out-of-tune fiddle, and the tired voices that sang through the night soft and imperfect, just like the people who lived for the music. Boxing, burbaiting, and bare-knuckle brawls. What passed for fun when the fiddle finally stopped squeaking and the last card was dealt? The saloon's true show often began. For the men and women of the frontier, boredom was a dangerous thing, and violence was one way to keep it at bay. Boxing matches weren't fancy affairs with gloves and rules. They were bare-knuckle brawls, brutal tests of endurance, where blood mixed with sweat under gasping cheers. Fighters could be seasoned professionals passing through, or local toughs trying to make a name or keep one. The prize? A few dollars, a bucket of beer, or just bragging rights that lasted until the next punch. Sometimes these fights were organized, with rough rings set up on the floor and bets placed in the shadows. Other times, they were spontaneous eruptions. Someone's pride got stepped on, words were exchanged, and fists flew before anyone could say, draw. Then there was burbaiting, a cruel, chaotic spectacle where dogs were set on chained bears. the crowd howling as the animals struggled. It was barbaric, brutal, and a favorite form of brutal entertainment before animal rights were a thing anyone thought about. People bet on which side would win, reveling in the raw spectacle of violence. Beyond the organized fights, the saloon floor was a minefield of potential violence. A spilled drink, a missed glance, or a bad joke could turn a room from laughter to chaos in seconds. Bar patrons often carried weapons, knives, pistols, or fists and kept them close. A brawl might start over a crooked card game, a woman's insult, or just the simmering tension of too many hard lives compressed into one place. Women in these fights were rare, but unforgettable. Some were tough as nails, ready to throw down and defend their honor, or that of their menfolk. The saloon was no place for delicate sensibilities. It was a crucible of raw human nature, where fun and fury mixed like whiskey and water. The aftermath? Broken noses, black eyes, split lips, and the ever-present threat of jail or worse. The town sheriff might intervene, if sober enough, or the fight might spill outside, where the consequences could be deadlier. Still, for many, these violent entertainments were the only release. The dull ache of loneliness, cold nights, and endless labor was momentarily replaced by adrenaline and chaos. It was a reminder they were alive, even if only barely. So the next time you imagine a Wild West saloon, picture the raw thud of fists on flesh, the roar of the crowd, and the sharp crack of a thrown bottle, because here, fun was as wild and dangerous as the land itself. The dance floor divide, gender, class, and that one step too far, the dance floor in a frontier saloon was more than a patch of wood. It was a stage where social rules were both enforced and tested. Men and women didn't just dance. They negotiated unspoken boundaries, a choreography of class, gender, and power. Women who danced here fell into many categories, from the wives of hardworking ranchers to the hurdy-gurdy girls, professional entertainers whose smiles were as worn as their boots. Their presence was often as much about keeping men's attention and their coins as it was about genuine fun. Class distinctions were sharp. The local businessmen and landowners rarely tangled with miners or cowboys on the floor, their dances marked by distance and polite restraint. A well-dressed gentleman might offer a polite waltz, while a roughneck preferred a rowdier jig or two-step. Crossing these lines could invite scorn or worse. The dance itself was often a test of control and rebellion. Men showed off strength and confidence. Women balanced grace with survival savvy. A too bold step, a lingering touch, or a glance that lingered longer than polite could quickly shift the mood from playful to confrontational. In some saloons, dances were organized events, a break from the routine, but often the floor became a stage for flirtation, power plays, and silent battles. Gossip flowed as freely as the whiskey, and every spin or stumble was noted, remembered, and retold. The atmosphere was charged, a mix of desire, danger, and desperation. A woman stepping too far out of line risked harsh judgment, or worse, ostracism or violence. Men who misread a dance partner's signals might find themselves shoved, mocked, or thrown out. Yet, beneath the strict social codes, dancing also offered brief moments of connection and escape. For just a few minutes, the weight of survival lifted, replaced by the rhythm of music and the warmth of human touch, even if fleeting or fraught. So when you imagine the dance floor in a Wild West saloon, think of it as a silent battlefield of eyes, gestures, and steps, a place where every move mattered. And the stakes were often higher than the dance itself. From laughs to gunfire, the moment it all went sideways, even the wildest nights in a frontier saloon usually started with laughter raucous, sloppy, and loud enough to drown out the creaking timbers and rattling doors. The music played, the drinks flowed, and the poker chips clattered, weaving a tapestry of noise that wrapped the room in a rough kind of warmth. But the West was a place where patience was thin and tempers thinner. A careless word, a spilled drink, or an accidental shove could ignite tensions faster than a dry prairie grass fire. The line between joke and insult was razor sharp, and the room held more grudges than a canyon held echoes. Sometimes it was a long simmering feud, a grudge carried over from months or years, finally boiling over in the heat of a crowded bar. Other times, it was the kind of fight born from drunken bravado, one man claiming a slight, another defending his pride, and suddenly fists were flying. As voices raised, the mood shifted. Laughter gave way to jeers. The fiddle's melody was drowned by curses and threats, and the crowd's cheer turned into a tense silence, waiting for the inevitable. Then the guns came out. The sound of a pistol being cocked was a dark punctuation to the night. In saloons where everyone carried, the threat of gunfire was never far, and once a weapon appeared, reason often fled faster than the bartender could slam the door shut. Some shootouts were quick and brutal men, aiming to settle scores with a single shot, no second chances. Others dragged on, spilling into the streets as chaos followed like a shadow. In the aftermath, bodies might lie still, or men might stagger away nursing wounds and bruised pride. The saloon, once a refuge, turned into a battlefield, the sawdust floors stained with more than spilled whiskey. The law sometimes arrived too late, or not at all. In those wild places, justice was often a personal matter, settled with lead and grit. Yet, despite the danger, these moments were woven into the fabric of frontier life. The volatility, the sudden shift from laughter to violence, was as much a part of the saloon as the sawdust and the stale smoke. So as the night wore on and the last echoes faded, the stories of those moments lived on whispered in taverns, written in scars, and remembered by those who survived to tell them. Mixologist or mercenary? Knowing what to serve and who to cut off the barkeep in a frontier saloon was no mere drink dispenser. They were the night's silent strategist, part mixologist, part mercenary. Behind the bar, amidst the clinking glasses and sticky counters, the bartender weighed every decision with a sharp eye and a steady hand. Knowing who to serve was an art, and who to cut off could mean the difference between a quiet night and a brawl fueled by a drunken fool. Some patrons were welcome, the hard-working miners, tired cowboys, or traveling salesmen who kept their wits about them and their tempers in check. Others were walking trouble, bitter drunks, card cheats, or men nursing grudges, sharp enough to draw guns at the slightest provocation. The barkeep read these characters like a book worn thin from years of flipping pages, knowing when a man was 3 fingers past drunk and needed no more whiskey, and when another could hold his liquor just long enough to forget his troubles. Cutting someone off wasn't just about alcohol control. It was about survival, both theirs and the saloon's. The drinks themselves were a story. Whiskey was king, though often diluted with anything from water to turpentine. A barkeep might tweak a recipe to please a favored customer or to discourage the reckless, offering less burn for the steady hands and a sharp kick for those who needed to slow down. Serving was also a negotiation with power. Some patrons expected credit or special treatment. Others slipped the barkeep a little extra coin for special pours. But too many favors, and the delicate balance would tip leading to resentment, theft, or violence behind the scenes. The barkeep was both referee and confidant, listening to drunken confessions one minute and breaking up brewing fights the next. They kept tabs on bets, secrets, and alliances, making the bar a hub of whispered plots as much as spilled spirits. In the flickering candlelight and dusty haze, the barkeep's role was clear. Keep the drinks flowing just right, keep the peace just tight enough, and keep the doors open for one more night of this rough and raucous dance. Cleaning the uncleanable. Maintaining a saloon with 2 buckets and no soap. In the rough-and-tumble world of the frontier saloon, cleanliness was a luxury almost nobody could afford, except the barkeep, who had to pretend it mattered. with only 2 buckets, often filled from the town well or a stagnant barrel, and little to no soap. Maintaining even a hint of order was a daily, sweaty battle. Sawdust was the saloon's first line of defense. Thick layers of it blanketed the floors, soaking up spilled whiskey, mud, blood, and whatever else was spilled or splattered in the wild nights. By morning, this sawdust was a grimy, trampled mess, heavy with stains and the unmistakable scent of stale alcohol and sweat. Sweeping was mostly about moving the mess around and spreading it thin enough so patrons wouldn't slip more performance than true cleaning. The barkeep would shove the used sawdust into corners or out back, preparing to toss it on a fire or onto a back alley. The bar counters were sticky from 100 spilled drinks, cigarette tar, and the occasional bit of regurgitated whiskey. A quick wipe with a wet rag soaked in one of the buckets was about all the cleaning they could manage between customers. Soap was a rare treasure, often reserved for washing the odd shirt or patching up wounds. Glasses were rinsed with water that was sometimes cloudy, their rims coated with a faint film from countless mouths dry or drunk pressing against the glass. Sharing a glass was common. Washing them thoroughly was not. The bathrooms, when they existed, were often little more than outhouses behind the saloon, reeking of refuse and neglect. Sometimes the barkeep had to deal with the aftermath of a fight in these cramped spaces, cleaning up blood and broken bottles with grim efficiency. Even the furniture bore the scars of neglect and abused sticky tabletops, chipped chairs, and floorboards stained dark with decades of spilled stories and spilled drinks. Keeping a saloon clean wasn't about hygiene. It was about keeping the illusion of order in a place that thrived on chaos. The barkeep's constant half-hearted cleaning was a quiet, unseen labor, a battle against the inevitable decay of the night. Counting cash with one eye open, theft, bribes, and the quiet math of survival money in a frontier saloon was as volatile as the whiskey it bought. Every coin had a story, sometimes honest, often shadowed by whispers of theft, deceit, and desperate survival. The barkeep was a master accountant of risk, juggling debts, bribes, and the occasional light-fingered patron with a practiced eye. The cash drawer was a tempting prize. With so many passing hands, from miners flush with gold to drunks scraping for their last cent, the barkeep had to keep a watchful gaze on every coin exchanged. Thieves lurked not just outside, but inside the doorsmen who de-slipped coins or empty bottles under their coats when the barkeep looked away. Bribes were part of the nightly calculus. A quick nod, a little extra tucked beneath a glass, or a wink might ensure a favored customer got an extra pour or a night's credit. But this currency came with risks. Too much favoritism bred resentment among other patrons or suspicion from town law enforcement. Credit was a double-edged sword. Many regulars couldn't pay on the spot, and the barkeep often extended tabs with a grim understanding that some debts would never be paid. Balancing generosity with survival meant remembering who owed what and knowing when to cut someone loose. Keeping track was a subtle art. Mental ledgers held the sums, names, and grudges. The barkeep knew who paid their debts in stories, in labor, or with promises that often evaporated by morning. The quiet math of survival was not just about dollars, but about alliances and peacekeeping. A barkeep who could deftly manage the flow of coin in favor helped keep the peace and the saloon doors open another night. Every clink of a coin on the counter was a heartbeat in the precarious dance of frontier. Economics won, where one wrong move could mean empty pockets or a broken jaw. Dealing with death at the counter, when patrons drop and nobody blinks in the unforgiving world of the frontier saloon, death was never far. The barkeep often found themselves the first to witness a patron's last breath or a body slumping unnoticed against the counter. It was a grim part of the job, accepted with a weary, hollowed-out calm. Fights, illnesses, and accidents meant that some nights ended with more than just spilled drinks. A miner might collapse from exhaustion or the creeping poison of rot-gut whiskey. A gambler could fall victim to a knife wound or a bullet long before the final hand was dealt. The barkeep, juggling bottles and broken promises, became an unwitting witness to these last moments. There was little ceremony, no tears or farewells. The other patrons often continued their raucous revelry, or they simply turned away, hardened by the harshness of life on the edge. Death here was a commonplace visitor, part of the background noise of creaking floors and clinking glasses. Sometimes the barkeep had to deal with the aftermath calling in a doctor or sheriff, disposing of the body discreetly, or shutting down the bar to clean up the stains no amount of sawdust could hide. All this while maintaining a steady hand and calm voice, ensuring the rest of the night carried on. Death at the counter was met with a strange mixture of indifference and respect. The frontier had no patience for sentimentality. Survival demanded stoicism. The barkeep's role was to keep the night moving, to absorb the tragedy without letting it spill over, lest the fragile peace shatter. This quiet endurance was part of the saloon as grim rhythm, a dance where life and death were intertwined, and the barkeep was the silent guardian of both. The morning after ritual, resetting the stage for chaos. As dawn breaks over the dusty frontier town, the saloon is a silent wreck-spent sawdust, trampled into a patchwork of stains, tables sticky with spilled whiskey and stale smoke, and chairs scattered like fallen soldiers from the night's battles. But for the barkeep, this quiet moment is just the calm before the storm. The morning after was a ritual, a slow, grim procession of cleaning, repairing, and resetting that began before the first light and stretched well into the midday sun. With a pair of buckets, a battered broom, and a rag as worn as the bar itself, the barkeep set about undoing the night's damage. Spilled drinks were scrubbed, or at least wiped, as best as the limited water allowed. Sawdust was swept up and tossed out back, only to be replaced with a fresh layer, ready to soak up tomorrow's disasters. Broken glass was carefully collected, though not always completely. Small shards remained a silent hazard for the unwary. The bar was wiped down, sticky fingerprints fading under slow, patient swipes. Empty bottles were gathered, counted, and stashed for reuse or sale. Tables and chairs were straightened, the furniture's dents and scars silently marking the history of the saloon's countless nights. Sometimes the barkeep nursed bruises, sore muscles, or a hangover lingering from the previous evening. Chaos proof that even the keeper of the night's secrets wasn't immune to its toll. Despite the endless cycle, the barkeep carried out these chores with a quiet determination, knowing that the saloon would soon come alive again. The doors would creak open to the clang of spurs, the thud of boots, and the murmur of familiar voices, all ready to plunge once more into the sawdust-strewn theater of vice and survival. And so the stage was set, the actors ready to return, and the drama, predictable, ugly, and strangely comforting, would play out again. Saloon justice, trials over tequila. In the wild frontier towns, the saloon was more than just a place to drown sorrows. It was often the courtroom, the judge's bench, and the jury all rolled into one rough-and-tumble room. When formal justice was miles away, disputes were settled amid the haze of tequila shots and whiskey slugs. Saloon justice was quick, loud, and messy. Arguments erupted over stolen horses, broken promises, or insults delivered slurred and unfiltered. Instead of gavels, there were fists and knives. Instead of laws, there were grudges and local customs. Sometimes the barkeep doubled as the sheriff's unofficial deputy, breaking up fights or ejecting troublemakers with a stern word or a well-aimed bottle. At other times, patrons took justice into their own hands, lynch mobs and shootouts erupting in the back rooms or alleys. Tequila was both the fuel and the evidence, its burn sharpening tempers and loosening tongues. Trials were held at the poker table, with bets placed on verdicts and punishments meted out by whoever was quickest on the draw. These ad hoc courts lacked order, but were deeply rooted in the survival code of the frontier. Protect your own, Avenge insults swiftly, and don't expect mercy from strangers. Justice here was as intoxicating as the drinks, unpredictable, fierce, and sometimes deadly. The sheriff's stool, lawmen in the barroom, on the wild frontier. Sheriffs and lawmen weren't just figures of authority. They were part of the nightly theater unfolding in the saloon's smoky haze. The sheriff's stool was often the most precarious seat in the house, balancing the weight of law enforcement with the ever-present lure of the bar. Lawmen arrived to the saloon not only to uphold order, but to partake in its dangerous rituals. A whiskey in one hand, a watchful eye on the room, they mingled among miners, drunks, gamblers, and outlaws. Each interaction a delicate dance between respect, fear, and suspicion. Their reputations preceded them, some known for a steady hand and calm demeanor, others for quick tempers and a trigger finger that ended disputes before they began. The bar was their courtroom and battleground, where they measured threats not with law books, but with keen observation and an iron will. The sheriff's presence could calm a brewing brawl or, at times, fan its flames. Patrons tested boundaries, pushed limits, and sought favors, knowing the lawman's authority was as much social as official. These men lived in the shadows between order and chaos, navigating a fine line where a wrong word or a spilled drink could ignite violence or cement uneasy peace. Behind the badge and the bottle, they were as human as the rest, haunted by the violence they'd seen, tempted by the escape the saloon offered, yet bound to the law they upheld. Drunk tanks and dry mornings, jails for the overserved, when the whiskey ran too deep and the night spiraled past the point of good sense. The frontier's answer was the drunk tank, a cold, unforgiving cell where the overserved went to sleep off their sins under lock and key. Unlike today's facilities, these holding cells were Spartan affairs, stone or wooden rooms with iron bars, a dirt floor, and little more than silence and solitude to accompany the pounding headache waiting to greet the morning. Being thrown into the drunk tank was both punishment and protection. It kept the town safe from brawling fools and spared the inebriated from the dangerous streets, where falling into a river or waking up in a stranger's barn were real threats. Lawmen often had to wrestle with whether to haul a troublemaker off to jail or cut them loose with a warning, balancing justice with practicality in towns that could barely afford a jailer. Morning brought groggy awakenings, stiff limbs, and the harsh light of regret. Some prisoners emerged chasing, others defiant, ready to return to the saloon's siren call. The drunk tank was a place of quiet desperation, a stark contrast to the chaos from which its occupants had been removed. One more layer in the Wild West's tangled relationship with booze, law, and survival. When the judge was drunker than you, courtroom versus saloon room. In frontier towns where law and liquor shared the same dusty streets, it wasn't uncommon for judges and officials to be as familiar with the barroom as the courtroom. The line between sober justice and drunken indulgence was thin, sometimes non-existent. Judges might preside over serious cases by day, but by night, they were known to stagger into the very saloons they were supposed to police. Their gavel replaced by a glass, their robes swapped for dust-stained boots and stained shirts. Courtroom proceedings could be delayed or influenced by nights spent under the saloon's haze, leading to judgments colored by last night's excesses. Witnesses and jurors alike might question the fairness of a ruling, and the judge's breath smelled as heavily of whiskey as the defendant's. At times, courtroom disputes spilled back into the saloon, brawls erupting before verdicts could be delivered, blurring the lines between law and lawlessness. This mingling of justice and indulgence revealed the frontier as harsh reality. The institutions of order were often fragile, flawed, and human, swayed as much by alcohol as by law. Hangings and headlines. When saloon stories ended in nooses, in the unforgiving lawscape of the Wild West, justice was swift and often deadly. Some of the wildest nights in the saloon ended not with cheers or fights, but with a rope tightening around a neck. When brawls turned fatal or crimes went unpunished by slow courts, frontier towns turned to hangings as a grim reminder that law, however rough, was still law. These public executions were sometimes preceded by noisy trials in the very bars where the sins were born. Saloon justice writ large, with the noose as final arbiter. The hanging tree stood not far from many towns, its shadow cast long over dusty streets and whiskey-soaked memories. Townsfolk gathered in uneasy silence, the rawness of frontier justice palpable in the air as the condemned faced their last moments. Newspapers, if the town had them, would later chronicle these events in stark headlines, mixing tragedy with a macabre sort of frontier pride. These stories became part of the saloon's lore, whispered between drinks and passed down as warnings to those who might tempt fate. Behind the spectacle lay a brutal truth. In the West, survival meant living on the knife's edge between lawlessness and order, and sometimes the price was death by hanging. Communal lice combs and cup sharing, the grooming habits of the damned in the smoky haze of the frontier saloon. Personal hygiene was less a priority and more a shared misery. Among the tools passed around with reckless abandon were the infamous communal lice combs, scraping through tangled hair, spreading pests as freely as gossip. These combs were wooden or metal, worn smooth by countless hands, their teeth dull and sticky with remnants of past users' misfortunes. It was common for entire groups to share a single comb, hoping to rid themselves of the persistent crawl of lice and fleas, though often only spreading the infestation further. Drinking vessels fared no better. Cups, mugs, and shot glasses often changed hands without a thought for cleanliness. Sharing drinks was a gesture of camaraderie, or sometimes necessity, as fresh supplies ran low. The grime and saliva left behind were unseen cocktails of bacteria, mingling silently with the whiskey or beer. This careless sharing extended beyond combs and cups. Hats, coats, and bedding in the saloon, or nearby lodgings, became breeding grounds for parasites, making the frontier a hotbed for these unwanted companions. For the patrons, lice were more than just a nuisance. They were an everyday fact of life, tolerated alongside the dust and the smoke, part of the grim tapestry that defined survival in this harsh, unforgiving world. Cholera, consumption, and cheap cigars. What was in the air and your lungs? The saloon's air was a toxic brew, thick with smoke, disease, and despair. Cheap cigars, smoldering in cracked lips, released clouds of harsh tobacco smoke that clung to the throat and lungs like a persistent fog. The scent mingled with the acrid smell of burning, kerosene lamps, and the ever-present stench of stale sweat and unwashed bodies. Beyond the smoke lurked invisible killers, cholera and consumption, the latter better known today as tuberculosis, spread through coughs and close quarters. The crowded, poorly ventilated rooms provided the perfect breeding ground for these deadly diseases, turning a night of supposed leisure into a gamble with fate. Patrons coughed and wheezed, their breaths rattling through chests already battered by years of hard labor and hard living. Deaths from these illnesses were common, often unspoken in the raucous saloon atmosphere, but silently acknowledged by the regulars who knew better than to get too close. Doctors were few, and remedies rarer. Instead, folk cures and superstitions floated like the smoke itself, sometimes helping, often harming. The cheap cigars that fueled conversations and calmed nerves were also a slow poison, weaving a fatal thread through the fabric of frontier life. Inhaling the saloon's foul air was a price paid nightly, a slow erosion of health hidden beneath the glow of oil lamps and the clink of glasses. Saloon soup, a stew of human fluids and bacteria. Imagine a pot simmering, not in a kitchen, but in the very floorboards beneath your boots. That was the saloon's unwelcome signature, a thick, invisible stew of human fluids and bacteria brewed beneath the surface. Sawdust, meant to soak up spills, absorbed more than just whiskey. Sweat, blood from bruised knuckles and broken noses, spit from harsh words and harsher insults, all pooled and soaked into the gritty floor, creating a damp, pungent mattress for crawling insects and unseen microbes. Communal cups, shared combs, and unwashed hands mingled pathogens freely. Patrons' bodies, worn and weary, carried infections that found easy hosts in this crowded environment. Cuts festered unnoticed, illnesses spread unchecked. Even the air was heavy with bacteria, stirred up by the constant shuffle of boots and the occasional burst of vomit that splattered the walls, and floor adding yet another layer to the saloon's toxic brew. This soup wasn't just unpleasant, it was a living hazard, a slow and steady assault on the health of anyone foolish enough to linger too long. Vomiting as a way of life, strategic purging and public shame in the wild frontier saloons. Vomiting wasn't just an unfortunate consequence of too much drink. It was a ritual, a necessary purge to survive another round, and a public spectacle wrapped in layers of shame and grim acceptance. The smell of sickness was as much a fixture as the creak of wooden floors or the murmur of low conversations. Patrons learned quickly. When the stomach rebelled, expelling last night's sins was the only way to clear space for more whiskey, more survival. Some mastered the art of strategic purging, retreating to the shadows of the back alley, hiding their weakness behind stoic faces. Others had no such luxury, vomiting openly amid laughter, curses, and slaps on the back, a brutal test of endurance and grit. Public shame was a currency here. To vomit prematurely was to risk ridicule. To hold it in was to invite disaster. The delicate balance between dignity and necessity played out night after night. The dance between drink and sickness was a brutal rhythm one that tested not only bodies, but the fragile social fabric of the saloon as ragged community. Dying in the corner booth, when last call really was the last, amid the haze of smoke and the clatter of bottles. Some nights ended not with staggering steps out into the dawn, but with stillness, the final silent surrender to the harsh life of the frontier. The corner booth, dimly lit and shadowed, often became an unintended resting place for those whose bodies finally gave out worn by drink, disease, and despair. Here, the living faded quietly, unnoticed at first amid the rowdy revelry. Death in the saloon was both common and taboo. Patrons learned to look away, to nod somberly, or to whisper prayers behind cupped hands. The barkeep might cover the fallen with a coat, making room for the next soul seeking solace in the bottle. These last calls were stark reminders of the saloon as brutal reality, a place where survival was a fragile, fleeting thing, and the night could claim you without warning. In these quiet moments, the wild frontier's harshness was laid bare. A whispered farewell to those caught in the endless cycle of drink, violence, and fading hope. The stoic stagger. How men showed pain by not showing pain. In the unforgiving world of the Wild West, showing weakness was a dangerous gamble. Pain, grief, and fear were met with a tough exterior, a stoic stagger, a slow, steady walk that said, without words, I endure. Men learned early that the saloon wasn't just a place to drink. It was a stage where their silent strength was tested and displayed. The louder the shout, the deeper the wound often hidden beneath. To stagger without falling was an unspoken badge of honor, a way to prove resilience in a land where survival depended on masking vulnerability. Even when bones ached or hearts broke, the saloon demanded a certain grit, a refusal to bend or break. Behind the steady eyes and weathered faces lay stories of loss and hardship, told in the quiet moments between slurred words and clinking glasses. The stoic stagger was more than a gait, it was a language, spoken fluently by those who had no choice but to carry their burdens alone. Initiation by intoxication, getting accepted at the barrel's bottom, stepping into a frontier saloon for the first time, was like entering a rite of passage. The scent of smoke, sweat, and stale whiskey hit hard, and the eyes of seasoned drinkers flickered with quiet judgment. To be accepted Newcomers had to prove their mettle, often at the bottom of a battered barrel. The initiation wasn't just about taking a drink, it was about embracing the shared chaos, the unspoken rules that bound these rough souls together. Shots were passed around, sometimes cut with bitter additives like turpentine or tobacco juice, testing not only tolerance, but nerve. Refusing a drink was a mark of weakness or disrespect, a sure way to be left out in the cold. Those who embraced the challenge earned nods of grudging approval, their place among the saloon's ragtag brotherhood quietly secured. This baptism by fire or whiskey was less about celebration and more about survival. It forged bonds that were as much about enduring hardship as sharing stories, a collective shield against the harsh frontier outside. The shame of sobriety. Teetotalers in a world of drink. In the Wild West saloons, abstaining from drink was a mark of suspicion and social exile. The saloon was the heart of community and commerce, alike a place where cups clinked, not just in celebration, but as currency of connection. Teetotalers stood apart, often viewed with quiet disdain or outright mockery. Their refusal to partake was seen as weakness, a rejection of the rugged spirit that defined frontier masculinity. In a world where strength was measured by how much one could endure, and how loudly one could laugh while doing it, sobriety was a lonely stance. These men walked a tightrope between isolation and survival. Some bore their sobriety with quiet dignity, finding strength in self-control. Others faced the crushing pressure to conform, the sting of whispered jokes and sideways glances. The saloon, as relentless tide of drink and noise, was a test of will, a trial by fire that many sober souls endured alone, their silence as loud as the saloon's raucous chorus. Emotional repression, frontier style. Crying into whiskey, never in public, the Wild West demanded a hard shell. Men learned quickly that showing emotion was dangerous territory. Vulnerability was a crack in the armor, an invitation to be preyed upon or dismissed. So the saloon became the hidden confessional, where grief, fear, and regret were swallowed down with another shot. Tears were shed in silence, blurred by the haze of whiskey, away from prying eyes and judgmental stares. Behind gruff words and rough laughter, many men battled unseen demons, lost families, broken dreams, the harsh weight of survival in a merciless land. But these battles were waged quietly, inside the mind, with the bottle as a silent witness. Crying into whiskey was not weakness. It was survival. The saloon offered a private stage for public repression, a place where emotions could leak out in whispers beneath the roar of drink and music. Fatherhood at the footrail, generational dysfunction, one drink at a time. The footrail of the saloon was more than a place to rest weary boots. It was the front row seat to the cyclical drama of frontier families. Fathers, hardened by years of hardship and drowning in drink, often passed down patterns of dysfunction as surely as their names. In a world where survival demanded stoicism and strength, emotional distance became the norm. Fathers who couldn't show tenderness found solace at the bar, their affections drowned in whiskey and smoke. Children watched from the shadows, learning lessons of silence and avoidance. Generations were shaped by this ritual of escape, where pain was numbed one drink at a time and connection was sacrificed for survival. The saloon became a surrogate home, a place where broken men sought to forget broken lives. Yet, amidst the haze, some hoped for something different, a quiet wish that one day the cycle might break, and that fatherhood might mean more than the clink of a glass and a distant gaze. The barmaid's burden, serving smiles under threat. Behind the worn wooden bar, the women who served drinks carried a heavy weight. Barmaids weren't just waitresses. They were the saloon's front line, navigating a world thick with tension, threats, and unwelcome eyes. Every smile was a carefully measured shield. Every polite word, a way to keep the peace in rooms filled with men whose tempers could flare as quickly as their thirst. These women had to master the art of invisibility, blending warmth with wary watchfulness. Threats, both spoken and unspoken, were a constant backdrop. Harassment was common, and the barkeep's protection was often the only thing standing between safety and violence. Barmaids learned to read the room like a map, avoiding trouble before it brewed. Their role was a dangerous balancing act. Keep the drinks flowing, the men pacified, and their own dignity intact. It was a job where smiles masked fatigue, fear, and fierce resilience. Sex work, survival, and stigma. What paid the bills? In the shadowed corners of the saloon and beyond, sex work was often the unspoken lifeline for many women. It was survival wrapped in whispers and worn smiles, a means to keep food on the table and a roof over weary heads. The line between barmaid and sex worker could be thin, blurred by necessity and circumstance. The stigma was sharp and unyielding, yet the harsh realities of frontier life left few choices. Madams controlled these secret economies, managing women's lives with a mix of protection and exploitation. Sex work was both a refuge and a trap, a world where power shifted unevenly, and survival often came at the cost of freedom. The stigma shadowed these women, isolating them socially, even as they fueled the saloon's undercurrent. Their stories were often hushed, but their presence was undeniable, woven into the very fabric of frontier life. Madams as moguls, women who ran empires of vice behind the closed doors and heavy velvet curtains, madams ruled with a firm hand and sharp mind. These women were more than just managers. Of brothels, they were savvy businesswomen who carved out empires amid the chaos of the frontier. Their establishments were carefully maintained operations, balancing danger, desire, and profit. Madams negotiated with lawmen, settled disputes, and protected their workers in a world where violence was never far. In a place where law and order were fragile, madams offered a semblance of stability, a structured refuge in the midst of disorder. They wielded influence that extended beyond the saloon's smoky walls, shaping the social and economic rhythms of their towns. Though their reputations were often tarnished by gossip and prejudice, madams held a unique, if uneasy, position of power, a reminder that even in the wildest places, women found ways to command respect and control. Mothers, wives, and widowhood, lives outside the saloon's glow, beyond the raucous laughter and clinking glasses. There were women whose worlds barely touched the saloon's smoky interior. Mothers, wives, and widows lived lives shaped by absence and endurance, their stories marked by resilience often overlooked. Mothers kept homes in fragile stead, balancing care for children with the harsh demands of frontier survival. Wives often faced loneliness and hardship, managing households while their men disappeared into the saloon's grip night after night. Widows carried the weight of loss and uncertainty, navigating a world where security was scarce and community judgment harsh. Their lives were a quiet counterpoint to the boisterous, chaotic world just beyond their doors. These women's strength was less visible but no less vital. They bore the emotional labor of frontier life, their endurance forming the backbone of families and communities. Suffrage meets the saloon. How temperance became political as the 19th century wore on. The saloon, once a symbol of frontier freedom, became a battleground for a new kind of fight. Women's suffrage and the temperance movement intertwined, seeking to curb the chaos and claim a voice beyond the footrail. Temperance advocates saw the saloon as a source of social decay, blaming drink for broken families and shattered communities. Their crusade wasn't just about alcohol, but about reclaiming power in a world that often sidelined women. Suffragists linked their cause to temperance, arguing that the right to vote was essential to bring about meaningful change. They marched, petitioned, and spoke out against the saloon's hold on society. Though progress was slow and met with fierce resistance, these movements planted seeds that would grow into broader social reforms. The clash between saloon culture and the push for temperance and voting rights was a pivotal chapter in the West's transformation. The saloon's legacy was forever entwined with the story of women who refused to be silenced. The rise of temperance, the slow squeeze of morality, the saloon's sawdust-strewn floors and boisterous laughter didn't disappear overnight. Instead, the West felt the slow, creeping pressure of a new forced temperance, a movement born from quiet conviction and loud sermons. In towns where whiskey once flowed like a river, churches and reformers began to sow seeds of restraint. They spoke softly but persistently about the dangers lurking in every glass, urging communities to trade disorder for order, vice for virtue. Temperance wasn't just about alcohol. It was a call for respectability, stability, and control in a land that had thrived on unpredictability. It crept into laws, schools, and social circles, slowly tightening its grip on everyday life. For some, the movement was salvation. For others, it was the slow death of a way of life won, marked by raucous nights, rowdy crowds, and the unvarnished truth of frontier living. Prohibition's first whispers, when the bottle looked like a threat, the rumblings against alcohol grew louder as the 19th century wore on. What had once been a tolerated vice transformed into a looming menace. Prohibition's earliest whispers slipped through town halls and courtrooms, promising a future where bottles might vanish and saloons shutter. For many, the idea was unthinkable, a direct strike at the heart of social life. The saloon was more than a watering hole. It was a community center, a place where deals were struck and friendships forged over clinking glasses. But reformers persisted, painting liquor as a poison that corrupted families, fueled crime, and crushed spirits. The bottle became a symbol not of freedom, but of downfall, a threat to the moral fabric that some desperately sought to protect. As laws tightened and licenses grew scarce, saloon owners found themselves caught between tradition and an unforgiving new order. The dance with the bottle was coming to an end, and with it, an era defined by sawdust and smoke. Changing towns, changing times, railroads, reformers, and real estate. The iron tracks of the railroad sliced through the wild landscape, bringing with them not just trains, but tides of change. Towns once rough-hewn and lawless began to shape themselves into orderly places, where saloons felt the squeeze of new neighbors and shifting priorities. Reformers clad in collars rather than leather moved in, carrying banners of progress, cleanliness, and temperance. Their voices grew louder alongside the whistles of locomotives, calling for streets paved with civility rather than sawdust and spilled whiskey. Real estate speculators saw opportunity in this new order, reshaping the economic landscape. The rowdy saloon gave way to quieter establishments, their floors swept, their doors less swinging, their bottles fewer and finer. The frontier was fading into town, and with it, the saloon's unruly spirit began to dim, a slow fade from chaos to civility, from wildness to order, from sawdust to linoleum. The evolution of the American bar, the rough-hewn saloon, with its sawdust floors and rowdy patrons, gradually transformed as America stepped into the 20th century. Linoleum replaced sawdust. Polished wood took over battered counters, and the wild spirit gave way to a more polished veneer. Bartenders, once rough characters themselves, became professionals mixologists, crafting cocktails instead of pouring rot-gut whiskey. The music softened, the brawls faded, the air cleared, literally and figuratively. This evolution wasn't just about aesthetics, but reflected shifting social norms. The bar became a place for socializing rather than survival, for leisure rather than escape. It was no longer a refuge from hardship, but a curated experience for comfort and connection. Yet beneath the shiny surfaces, echoes of the saloon's wild past lingered, ghosts of sawdust, smoke, and secrets, woven quietly into the fabric of every poured drink. Memory, myth, and the ghosts at the bar, what we remember and what we choose not to. The saloon lives on in our stories, painted as a place of daring gunfights, wild laughter, and rugged freedom. But the truth is quieter, rougher, and far less glamorous. We remember the myths, the shining heroes, the quick draws, the endless whiskey, but forget the mud, the blood, the grime, and the loneliness that filled those smoky rooms. The ghosts of the saloon linger not just in folklore, but in the very culture of the American bar. They remind us that beneath every polished surface lies a history of survival, desperation, and fleeting joy. What we choose to forget is as telling as what we remember. The saloon-esque story is a mirror reflecting the wildness we long for and the harsh truths we often turn away from. As the lights dim on this chapter of history, the echoes remain a slow, dusty sigh from a time when the West was wild, and the bar was both refuge and ruin. So that's the story. Not polished or glorious, but worn, wind-beaten, and real. If you're still with me, thank you for sharing this quiet hour and letting the past drift across your night. I hope somewhere in the dust you found a little peace. If this helped you sleep, or if you simply enjoyed the stillness, please like the video and subscribe if you'd like more slow journeys like this. Let me know where you're listening from and how far into the night you made it. Tomorrow, we'll wander somewhere new. Maybe colder, maybe darker, maybe even stranger, but still slow, still true, still waiting for someone to remember. Until then, sleep well. There are more stories to come.